Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now this episode is going to change the way you think about memory. Because what if memory isn't just something that lives in your brain? What if your cells, yes, even things like your kidney cells, are holding on to their own experiences? My guest is Dr Nikolay Kukushkin, a neuroscientist whose work radically redefines our understanding of memory. Nikolay is the author of a new book called One Hand Clapping, Unraveling the Mystery of the Human Mind. Now, when we recorded the episode, the book title wasn't confirmed, so you won't hear us mentioning it on the show, but there is a link to the book in the show notes. You'll be familiar with the idea that memory is stored in neural circuits, and that's all about how the brain works. But Nikolay's research suggests that memory is something much more fundamental, perhaps even a property of all living cells. In the episode, we explore the idea that memory might not be limited to conscious recall or brain activity. Nikolay takes us from sea slugs to kidney cells, showing how cellular patterns of experience can lead to lasting change, and how that might be the true biological essence of memory. We talk about the difference between scientific and everyday definitions of memory, what's really going on when we talk about muscle memory, and why how we space out our learning might be far more important than how long we spend doing it. We dive into some philosophical territory, like why false memories aren't a failure of memory but a feature, what it means to run out of memory in a modern overstimulated world, and how AI might be edging closer to something that resembles consciousness. We even revisit a childhood worry of mine about whether cramming a silly song lyric into my head might make me forget my own name. It's wide-ranging, revelatory, and surprisingly personal. If you've ever wondered how memory really works, or what your body might be remembering without you, then this is a conversation you won't want to miss. It's my discussion with Dr. Nikolay Kukushkin on memory. Nikolay, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Christian.
I'm really excited to have you here because you are going to help me answer a question that has bugged me from my childhood. But before we get to that, tell my listeners a little bit about yourself.
I study memory, and I study memory at a very deep level. I don't necessarily study human memory. I study memory in principle, in general, the concept of memory, the memory at its deepest level. And so what that means is I went from sea slugs to kidney cells. That's the most natural transition, but I have to explain that. When we think of memory, we usually think about, what happens when you close your eyes and think back to yesterday. But that's not what science understands to be memory. In science, whether you're studying sea slugs or mice or any other animal, a memory is a change in a behavior. It is something that happened to an animal that modified its brain or its body or something else in the animal. And then later on, the animal is behaving differently. It's moving in a different way. So that's already kind of a different thing from how most people think about memory. So scientists and, normal people think about memory in different ways. So my research is basically taking one step further from this normal way that we think about memory internally, introspectively, and asking, okay, well, if memory is a change in behavior, does that mean that it only appears when you plug in a muscle into a brain, that the animal has to move somehow? That just seems silly. So maybe it is even more abstract than this change in behavior. Maybe it's really any change that happens in a cell, in an organism, even to a molecule that persists for a later time and changes some way in which it acts. So that's the foundation of what I do. And basically what we found was that if you think of memory this way, then it turns out that it's not just us humans, it's not just animals that have memory. Actually, any living system has memory. A cell has memory. And what we've discovered is that it's not just a metaphor to say that. It's not just that, it's a similar process, what happens in a generic cell of our body compared to what happens in our brain. Actually, it's the same process that's happening to our brain cells when we learn something. Also happens to, for example, kidney cells. That's what we used in our research. So all cells in our body have their own experiences. It doesn't mean that kidney cells store our childhood memories or how to ride a bike or something like that. They have their own experiences. Every living system, including every cell of our body, have their own experiences. They see chemicals, salts, nutrients, liquids passing through them at different times and different patterns and different quantities. That's their experiences. And the patterns of those experiences modify each cell in our body, in any body, in some specific ways that we still know very little about. Basically, what our research shows is that pattern matters, and every part of our body can change in response to this pattern of experiences. And that's really what memory is. So that's in a nutshell what I study.
Wow. So in essence, if I looked at a common term that we'll all have heard of, muscle memory, you're actually saying there's some validity to that, right? So it's not just a metaphor. It exists in some way, shape, or form.
That's an excellent question. When we say muscle memory, usually we don't mean muscle memory. Usually what we mean is this special kind of learning that happens in the brain, a special part of the brain and the basal ganglia. It automates some behavior. So initially when we start learning something, we do it with a different part of the brain. We direct every movement with our cortex. Cortex is like the master conductor of everything that happens in the brain, the highest order machine of understanding. And so when you're learning to play piano, for example, you are directing every muscle with that cortex initially. But then later on, as you learn to move your fingers in a specific way, those combinations of movements, they get outsourced to this other part of the brain, the basal ganglia. And it stores not just individual movements, but the combinations of those movements. And then it can play them out in response to a cue. So you think of a part of a melody, and then your fingers just play it. And it feels like muscle memory. It feels as if your muscles know that. But actually, it's stored in these basal ganglia. It's still brain memory. But there is actually something that we could refer to as muscle memory. Literally, muscle cells can also get modified in response to what's happening to them. We don't think about it this way, but exercise is an excellent example of that. I mean, pattern of exercise, depending on how frequently you use those muscle cells, will cause them to either grow if you're exercising right, or maybe shrink if you're not using those muscles. That's the exact same way as brain cells change in response to experiences. This principle, use it or lose it, that really applies to brain cells, to muscle cells in the same way. And actually, even the molecular mechanisms, the mechanics, the gears and cogs that turn in those cells in response to a pattern of learning something repeatedly when you're studying for an exam, versus a pattern of exercise, repeating an exercise repeatedly. They will change brain cells and muscle cells in very similar ways, using the same molecular architecture to modify them. So there is something that we could literally call muscle memory. That's just not what most people refer to when they say muscle memory.
And I'm fascinated. How do you get into this? Because you joked about it, right? But it's a really interesting path. What was it that prompted you to follow that?
There's two ways that you can come into neuroscience, because neuroscience is this intersection between your mind and your body, right? It's between molecules and what you experience. It's this interface between the two, and you can come to it from both directions. You can come to it from psychology, and I think that's where most people start. They start getting interested in how people think, or where their personalities come from. And then you get into, okay, how does that work on a small scale? How does that work in terms of molecules and synapses and cells? I came to it from a different direction because I am at heart a cell biologist and a molecular biologist. I started with chemistry, with atoms and then proteins, and that's kind of my wheelhouse. That's what I was interested in. I was always fascinated by information processing by molecules. Like, for example, in my PhD, I studied this. It's kind of obscure, nobody really talks about this, but there's this quality control for proteins in each cell. So each cell makes proteins. Some of those proteins, a lot of them actually, they receive this carbohydrate tag. So first, the protein is made, it's fresh, just made, and immediately it gets this carbohydrate tag, which is very specific structures, this tree of sugars that is very specific, and it acts as a barcode for this newly made protein. And then it gets passed around between other proteins that shape it, that modify it, that fold it in the correct way. And each one that takes that protein trims a little bit of that carbohydrate. And then the next one grabs onto that trimmed carbohydrate. They use it as this tag to pass it along one step at a time. And eventually the protein is fully formed, matured, and ready to go. So that was my starting point in biology in general. And I'm just amazed by this idea that these molecules, these substances, these chemicals, they can talk to each other and pass information and orchestrate this complicated industrial process. And if you know a little bit more about it, you realize that the entire cell is like this. The entire cell is this world of molecules talking to each other and hustling and bustling around. And that was my starting point. And I think from there, I wanted to then understand, okay, how do we build a mind out of this? You start from these foundations, and it's not just in humans, but in plants and fungi and single-celled creatures. They all have all these components, and then somehow out of those similar components, you build up, well, a sea slug's brain, which is already pretty incredible, and then a mouse brain, which is absolutely mind-blowing, and then a human brain, which is just magical and otherworldly. So that building up was the part that was interesting to me. How do you construct a mind, a behaving animal that lives in this world, that interacts with this world, out of these molecular components? So that's where I started. And then from there, well, so I did my PhD in this process that I just described, and I was working in other cellular processes, protein degradation, so still inside the cell. And then from there, I went to Tom Caru's lab here at NYU. And Tom Caru's been studying sea slugs for decades. That's what he's famous for. Why sea slugs? Well, because in sea slugs, the journey that you have to take from the molecules to the behaving animal is very short. It's much shorter than than all the steps you have to go through in a mouse, let alone a human. We are so complicated that there's layers upon layers upon layers upon layers over this molecular logic. But in a sea slug, you can get there to real life, basically, to the life of this animal in a couple steps. You get from the cell to a neuron, which is a special cell. It's a pretty simple neuron compared to mouse neurons or human neurons. It only has a couple contacts. You have this neuron connected to another neuron, and that's it. And that's all that changes. That's all that changes when the animal experiences something, and you can see that change. You can see that change in its behavior and its reflexes. So you can understand what's happening in those couple cells, in the synapse between them, and you can then project it onto, okay, that's what it means for the life of this animal. That's how it would work in real life. And from there, you can start understanding, okay, and what if we make it a little bit more complicated? What if we make it a lot more complicated? And then you can start to understand how the human brain works. So basically what I'm saying is that my path was from the bottom up. Most people, I think, go from the top down, and we meet in the middle.
And so I'm fascinated how you've sort of worked out that, okay, that's how the brain works. How do you then take that? Were you looking at other parts of the body before you got to the brain, or is it you start with the brain and then you work out that it applies to other bits?
Well, yeah. So I spent a few years working in sea slugs, and sea slug, you start with a simple reflex with those couple of neurons, and then you see how those neurons change. And actually, you can see that change even if you just take an individual neuron. You take an individual neuron and put it in a petri dish, and instead of giving experiences to the animal, you give a neurotransmitter to that single neuron. And you observe those changes in the cell, you see what molecules change. And then those changes are the changes that make the animal behave differently. You block those things in an animal and it doesn't do it. So you can understand the memory of this animal, a real life memory, just by looking at a single cell with chemicals pulsed at it at different times. So from there, you can see as one more step to ask, do we even need neurons for this? Maybe this is something that any cell can do. If you pick the right chemical that the cell can understand, that it can perceive, that it has receptors to, maybe this patterning will also produce distinct responses in generic cells. So it was this idea that, can we go one step further? We've already simplified memory to as simple as it gets, but we're still in neurons. But maybe we're holding on to neurons just because we're used to this idea that it's only neurons that are holding memory. And it turns out to be true. Actually, if we activate in generic cells, like those kidney cells, the same molecules that are activated in neurons, and we can do that. We have special chemicals that can directly go into that cell and turn on those proteins that we know are activated in neurons. If you do that, then those cells modify themselves. And they don't just modify regardless of the pattern. They are sensitive to very short minute scale patterns of those chemicals applied to them. That's something that we expect from neurons. We know that neurons are fast cells. They understand millisecond differences in inputs and they respond to them in different ways. But we don't expect kidney cells to have this resolution at minutes, potentially even seconds. We haven't gotten to seconds yet, but we're working in that direction. But even minutes is surprising. Most people think of them as, they understand hours and days maybe, when most people work with a cell like a kidney cell. If they are treating them with some chemical and watching what happens, usually that chemical would like for an entire day, or at least for a few hours. But to give it something for 3 minutes, remove it, and then to give it again for 3 minutes and observe that those cells can detect, so what we did was the big difference in the paper that came out in November was 4 3-minute pulses spaced 10 minutes versus one long 12-minute pulse. So spaced versus massed training. And that those cells can detect. They produce a stronger response, a stronger, more lasting change in response to the spaced application of chemicals versus one massed crammed application of that stimulus. That's something that we've never expected from these generic cells, to understand differences of minutes. We thought that it was only a neuron thing, but turns out any cell can do that.
So is the difference between the process as it happens in the brain and the process that happens anywhere else, and I'm thinking human body here because it's the easiest for me to process, is it just the point of what I would call salience, is that you're aware it's happening? So if muscle memory, to use the literal term, or kidney memory, or whatever we want to say, that it's the difference is purely from what you're saying is just the salience, I guess, that the brain is aware that it's creating memories. Or maybe it's not.
I think so. I think it's a good way to put it. Yes. The question is, where does that salience come from? And it also ultimately comes from the differences between neurons and other cells. I mean, what really makes a neuron different? What the temptation is to say that it's the electrical pulsing. That the brain is an electrical organ, and that's what's different. But actually, there's lots of bioelectricity in lots of cells. Mike Levin studies bioelectricity as one of the fundamental organizational principles of living matter. For example, beta cells in the pancreas, the cells that produce insulin, the hormone that controls sugar, they're also electrically charged. They also produce those spikes of electricity that release that insulin into the bloodstream. It's just like in the brain. So that's not what makes them special, those brain cells. I mean, it's one of the features that they're very good at, but it's not unique. What's really unique is synapses. Is the fact that each neuron can specifically connect to 1,000 cells at its input end and 1,000 cells at its output end. And it can recognize that there are different connections, and I can make one connection stronger and I can make one connection weaker. That's what neurons can do that no cells can do. Most cells communicate with each other by sending out a chemical signal, say, into the bloodstream, and like a hormone. And all the body receives it. It's like a radio transmission. That's how most cells operate. If it's not a global radio transmission, it might be a localized radio transmission, something in the neighborhood. But there's no specificity. It's not that I send a message to that cell over there, but I won't send it to its neighbor, and to that cell in the totally different place in the body, I will send a much stronger signal. That specificity doesn't happen in other cells. Neurons can do that. So these specific connections between neurons is what allows for networks, for neuronal networks. And salience that you talk about, I would say it arises as a result of these networks talking to each other, because networks can generate much more complex information. They can construct information from many cells talking to each other and use that information to analyze itself. That's what really salience is. So it's not that I'm saying that neurons are just like any other cells and there's nothing special about them. No, neurons are very smart cells. They can hold on to a lot more information, a lot more specific information than other cells can. And because of that, brains are the specialized organ that controls our personality, that contains our skills, that gives us awareness. But that doesn't mean that other cells don't have memory. Memory does not require salience. Memory can be something that happens outside of our awareness, and we don't even know about.
So I'm listening to this and I'm thinking this is really exciting, but I'm trying to place it in. What do we do with that? Like, what
Hmm.
are the practical applications? Because it's fascinating, but I'm just sort of thinking, okay, so my body it works again. I was going to say it works in a different way to the way we thought, but it works in the same way. You were saying
Hmm.
than the brain. Where does that take us?
Yeah. So the short answer, we don't know yet. What our study is a proof of principle, but what I think we can take out of this is that patterns matter on a surprisingly short scale. I think that's the take home message. We don't know exactly what patterns matter how yet, but we understand that minute scale differences in how you interact with your body can make long term differences. So it might mean, for example, that there is some optimal pattern of exercise that we haven't discovered yet. Maybe, if you do your squats, if you repeat them 10 times and then wait half an hour and then repeat them 20 times, that will be way better than just doing 30 squats. I don't know. I've made it up, but it's possible. Our study shows that it's possible that such things will actually make a difference. Food. We take in nutrients at random times, in random combinations. We don't know what do those patterns lead to, how they modify our digestive system, our hormonal system, even our brain. We don't know how those patterns affect our body, but we now understand that they do, and they might affect more than just our brain. So anything we do on a schedule, I think, could be affected. Food, exercise, medicine. Maybe there is an optimal pattern of medical treatment. Chemotherapy is one excellent application of that, potentially. Maybe there is an optimal pattern of applying a chemotherapeutic drug that would prevent resistance, that would increase the killing of cancer cells. At the moment, we don't have a theory to support any specific time pattern. The idea is usually, if you're giving a patient a drug, just try to maintain it at a constant level for as high concentration as a patient can take. I mean, chemotherapy is poison, so you want to get it as high as possible with the patient being able to take it, and then just keep that concentration going until you kill all the cancer cells. That's the general basic idea. But maybe there's a better way. Maybe if you pattern that chemotherapeutic agent in some unexpected, surprising, fine-tuned way, it would actually produce a more strong killing of those cancer cells. We don't know yet, but it opens up a whole new way of thinking about diet, about exercise, about uh, disease, and really anything that we do to ourselves on a schedule.
And that's such a simple point, but like as you're talking, I'm just thinking we have lots of patterns that we've taken for granted that we've just sort of. And if I go back to a lot of where the way we do things comes from, then
Hmm.
comes from like primitive places. There is no level of sophistication. So I love this idea that you're just
Yeah.
throwing open. I wasn't expecting an answer that was going to be that kind of wholesome, I guess, but that's a really positive way of saying we can start to think about because obviously we sort of think about circadian rhythms and those sorts of things.
Hmm.
But that's logic to the brain, and we've got a bit of knowledge of it. But I love this. That's a really uplifting. It's brilliant in a way because it's uplifting in the sense of it could go anywhere. So it's sort of exciting and slightly mysterious.
Yes, I agree with you. It's uplifting to me, but there's also a dark way of looking at it. Because if you extend this logic into the future, if you start imagining what that might mean, as we learn about all these patterns, as we realize that, well, actually, you can't eat a yogurt within 5 hours of eating any tomatoes, and you must do exercise exactly on the schedule unless you drink at least 2 liters of water for once you start marking up your life into those fine patterns, and you start optimizing every cell of your body towards maximum success, I mean, that can become really obsessive really fast. And do we really want to know? I'm not sure.
I love this. So as you're thinking about pattern, I mean, presumably, like this must be playing on your mind. Are you much more conscious of your own patterns as a result of the work that you do?
I can't say that I've made the leap into thinking about my kidney memory in my everyday life, just because I don't know what those cells are actually memorizing. If I knew, maybe I would start thinking
Right. Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that. But I definitely am aware of what goes into my brain and at what pattern, and what are the inputs. I think I'm very mindful of the inputs in my brain, just because there's in our modern world is so many things that are chaotically entering your brain that, well, if you want to remember things that you want to remember, if you want to stay sane, I think you have to be selective about what you let into that brain. We just have so much stimulation. We have so many things to remember compared to, I think, what people used to in the past.
And that takes me to the childhood question I referenced before. So the younger version of me, and thank you for getting us there, the younger version of me would not let me finish the show without asking you really simple. I was always musing as a kid because we were told that we only use a certain capacity of our, I'm probably misremembering, but there's something about you're not using the full capacity of our brain. And therefore, kind of like there's a long way to go before we run out of space in my childhood brain. And therefore I was always worried that I would displace a useful piece of information from my brain, like my name, with, I don't know, a ridiculous song lyric. Is the younger version of me right to be worried about?
I think that your younger version of yourself was surprisingly astute in
It's gone downhill
perceiving
from
this
there,
as
I
a
can tell.
problem. I'd say there's two parts to the answer. The part about the 10% of the brain, it's not how most people think about it. There's this idea that we use 10% of the brain, and it's very attractive in the sense of, well, if I used 100, maybe I would be Einstein, I would be a genius, a superhuman mind. But I think where this number comes from is it's sort of a rough estimate of how much of your brain are you using at any given time. It doesn't mean that there's 90% of the brain that's just sitting there idly and, doing nothing and waiting for some
Sort of
to
like on
turn on
standby,
someday.
just in case he gets to.
Yeah, just in case you want to become Superman at some point. No, it's not. That's not what it means. But you're not using all of your brain cells at all time. The closest is probably an epileptic seizure when everything starts firing up. It's just like a wildfire that goes through the brain, and we don't want that. We want selective engagement of different neurons, and that's probably what gives you 10%. I don't know the exact number. I mean, it would obviously vary, but that's probably a reasonable ballpark of how many cells are active at any given time. The thing about memory is that it's not that it's stored somewhere in a particular place in the brain. It's stored in every cell. And, now we know that it's not even just in brain cells and in kidney cells as well. And although we don't really perceive our memory to be finite, it's not like a computer suddenly tells you, oh, I ran out of memory, I can't remember anything new. We don't experience it this way. Suddenly you can't memorize anything at all, and you have to, delete something or wait until it clears out. We don't feel it this way, so it doesn't seem like memory has a limit. But I think the closest that we can get to understanding what that memory limit would be sleep deprivation. Sleep has a complicated relationship with memory. Different phases of sleep act differently. Some parts of sleep, they're needed for memory consolidation, to rehearse some of in dreams. We rehearse something that happened to us during wakefulness, and maybe we come out with new combinations and maybe we remember them. So those are all things that happen to memory during sleep. But the fundamental role of sleep on memory, not just in humans, but in all animals, in any animal that has a nervous system, is to weaken synapses. Because during wakefulness, synapses generally tend to strengthen. It's the same, use it or lose it. If we're using them, generally, it's not always the case, but generally speaking, they tend to become stronger and stronger and stronger. So the signals that pass through neurons, they become, there's more of them. They start passing around, through wider lanes. It's every lane becomes widened to an extent that all the information is just wildly bouncing around the brain. And if a person is sleep deprived for a very long time, they start seeing hallucinations. So that's what happens when you don't weaken your synapses back. So normally you strengthen them during the day, and then at night they weaken back to normal, to the average level. So the synapses that you've strengthened remain stronger, but the average level goes back down. So that's required for you to keep remembering, to keep writing on new things onto that slate. So the weakest memories will get forgotten. Things that you don't use will eventually get wiped away, will decay. Kind of like a social media feed. I think of it this way. If you keep interacting with a post, they stay afloat, and if you don't, they go bounce down. Eventually everybody forgets about them. So the same thing with a memory. But if you don't weaken, if you don't sleep, then everything becomes saturated and everything becomes equivalent, and you don't see the difference between reality and imagination. and everything is at the same level of intensity, basically. And that's what sleep deprivation leads to. So I think that is our vision for what would happen if we ran out of memory. If we saturate our brain to such an extent that we stop seeing differences between reality and imagination, between new and old, between, what happened today versus what happened a year ago, that's running out of memory. It's not that it will just stop and refuse to introduce any new information. It will just be that all information is equivalent, and we don't see any difference between, it's all this continuous soup. And isn't that exactly what is happening to our brains? I mean, when I dive into social media, that's exactly how I feel. I feel like this soup is passing through my brain. I can't tell what I've seen before, what I haven't seen before, what is a memory and what is reality, and what happened yesterday, and what is a news, and what's something that's actually a 10-year-old video. It's all just washing through our brain, and that really reminds me of that description of what happens to people after sleep deprivation. So I think that's running out of memory. I think we might be at that point where we have to, make sure that we weaken our synapses a little bit, so that we reduce the background, so that we can create more salient memories.
So the answer to the younger version of me is I should be okay with my name because I'm using it a lot. And it's important,
That's
it's
right.
significant enough. And
Yeah.
therefore, I guess where my brain then would take me is to say that if I were, there are certain sort of, torture, for example, where people, but, prisoners, numbers are used as opposed to their names, right, to degrade them slightly. You could sort of see an
Mm.
extremist of that. You would lose, your name isn't used very often, so you'd lose it. So I guess I'm feeling reassured on the basis I'm
Mhm.
unlikely to forget my name. But also, I think you make some really interesting points about, I guess, capacity and what we're asking our memory to do nowadays. And I'm fascinated when we think about things like false memories, where you would
Mhm.
think the logical thing would be you've been through a really awful experience. You ought to be able to remember it really well because it's significant. And yet
Mhm.
we've seen all these
Mhm.
examples of people who recall things that never happened.
Yeah. And the temptation is to think about it as a failure of memory. But the thing is that we do want our memory to be malleable. That's what nature instilled in this memory. So there's this process called reconsolidation. And what that means is that anytime we recall a memory, it becomes malleable. It becomes vulnerable. You can actually erase it if you put in specific inhibitors, specific drugs in that moment. Put it when the person isn't, or an animal is not in the process of recall, when they're just going about their day without thinking about it. Put that same drug then, nothing will happen to the memory. But if you do that as they are recalling it, that will destroy the memory. So the memory becomes vulnerable, and that's there so that we can update it, so that we can incorporate new information. It is less important for a wild animal to remember every specific detail down to the letter. That's a very human thing. It's more important to keep it flexible, to maintain the general sense of that memory while updating it with new experiences. So false memories are not a bug; it's a feature. It's that's how our memory is supposed to work. There's also some excellent studies about um, one about 9/11 memories. There have been a couple of studies where memories of significant events or during significant events have been tracked over time. I think the Challenger disaster was one, 9/11 was another. So what happens is just after 9/11, maybe the next day or very very shortly after it, researchers interviewed a bunch of people, I think hundreds of people, about their experiences during 9/11. So what were they doing? Where were they? How do they feel? Emotional and factual memories. And then they came back to them a year later, 3 years later, and asked again to recall what they were doing on that day. And basically, it's it's very bad. By a year, I think a third of the content is changed, and by 3 years, almost a half of it is gone. And especially the emotional interpretation of that memory is totally different. So it's just an example. It's just a convenient case to track some specific memory over time, but it probably happens to all of our memories. We as we think about them, as we modify them, we add color, we add emotion, and sometimes even the factual content can change. And it's not that this memory is not real. It is real. That's how it is in our brain. It's not it's not related to reality. That's how all memory works. So on the one hand, you could think of it as a problem. If you think about eyewitness testimony, how can you trust eyewitness testimony if we know that our memory is constantly modified by us thinking about it? But on the other hand, I think it is a hopeful thing that no memory is final, and even traumatic memories can get modified. Reconsolidation therapy is an idea based on that by bringing up a traumatic memory and then providing some sort of different interpretation of it, some surprising twist on it, you can gradually replace this memory with something else, override it essentially with something else. We can't erase a memory. We don't have a technique to erase something, but I think reconsolidation is the closest that we get to erasing a memory. We can gradually override it with something else. And that's a good thing.
I've seen you write, and I thought it was really important to pick this up about exam cramming and how that works and whether that's a good idea or not. And as a proponent, back to my younger self, I was incredibly lazy. So I was somebody that probably hadn't done the work that I should have done, which is why my academic career stalled when it did. So for me, cramming was a way that I got through my exams. That seemed to work for me. But I've read you talking about it's not a good idea because that's not effective, I think.
Yeah, so it appears to be one of the most fundamental features of memory. And this was originally first documented by this German scientist named Hermann Ebbinghaus. He did experiments on himself.
He's the one with the circles that appear to be different sizes depending on what's surrounded. Is that the same Ebbinghaus?
I think so, yes. I think that's a separate part of his work. I think so, yes. But also he studied his own memory, and he memorized these nonsense syllables. He had these lists of meaningless words, and he would just sit there and, repeat them to himself at regular documented intervals, and then try to recall them and, write down how many here. He just turned his whole life into this memory experiment. And it was really the first time that somebody studied memory scientifically. To us now it's normal. That's just a part of neuroscience. But at that time, memory was seen as something intangible. It's part of your soul. It's strange to study it using numbers and graphs. And he was the pioneer in doing that. And he discovered this. Discovered. Lots of people knew about it. He documented it for the first time. And since then, this what we call spacing effect, it's been shown in pretty much every animal, even individual neurons, neuronal cultures, and now we've seen it in non-neuronal cells as well. So it seems to be this really basic property of memory. And what it is a crammed stimulation. If you have the same amount of training, stimulation, whatever you call it, if you do it in one go, like you said, crammed in one go, you will produce a worse memory than if you space it in time. And the spacing interval is critical. It can't be infinitely long, because then it's just individual small pulses. They're not connected to each other. And it can be infinitely small, because then it's crammed. So there is some optimal timing between those training sessions or stimulations that creates the superior memory. And that interval is not a zero and is not infinity. That's what the spacing effect is. And we've seen it everywhere.
And so does that presume, logically, I'm trying to justify my past behaviors. Logically, it could be a good strategy if all I care about is remembering it for the exam the next day. That could work. But I'm guessing you're talking about longer term memory. So if I really want to retain these useful information for the longer term, not a smart strategy. But that's not to say that cramming's bad if your tactic is just to get through the exam the next day.
Well, it will give you something. In our model, we always test 3 things. 4 pulses separated by 10 minutes, 1 long pulse, and 1 short pulse. 1 long pulse will give you a better memory than 1 short pulse, but a worse one than 4 spaced short pulses. And I think what you're asking is basically amplitude versus decay, how much you get initially versus how slowly it decays. What we are seeing is that both are better with spaced training. You get a stronger initial memory after that last training session, and also it decays slower. Actually, that is another really surprising feature of memory. It's a little bit more nuanced. but it is unusual speaking biochemically or in terms of cell biology. It's intuitive to us because it's how memory works. It's obvious. You get a stronger memory, it decays slower. But actually, if you think of any typical biological process, biochemical process, that's not how it works. For example, some chemical like starch, if your like a cell synthesizes this starch, there's an enzyme that makes this starch. Let's say you've somehow boosted that enzyme and you made twice as much starch. Usually what that means is that twice as much starch will also degrade twice as fast. The more you make, the faster it decays. The less you make, the slower it will decay. That's the typical situation. That's how biochemistry normally works, but not memory. In memory, the more you make, the slower it decays. And if you make less, it decays faster. So that's another thing that Ebbinghaus has documented for memory. It's called the forgetting curve. And we've seen that same thing in our kidney cells as well. If you produce a superior memory initially, it will also decay slower. It's not trivial to explain using just simple biochemistry, but that's how memory works. And that's why we're confident in saying that. It's part of the reason why we're confident in saying that it's not a memory in quotation marks that these cells have. It is the same process. It's the same biology with the same properties, spacing effect, forgetting curve. They all have that.
And as you think about your brain, I mean, I'm guessing it's kind of like it always fascinates me. There's certain types of research where you can switch off, right? Because you walk out of the lab and you can't do the experiments anymore because you don't have. You've got the raw materials to be thinking about your study.
Oh, yeah.
How do you switch off from it? Because I imagine this is, I mean, you clearly love what you do because you talk passionately about it and you wouldn't have got to where you've got to if you weren't keen on it. So to a certain extent, it's joy and excitement. But does it, I mean, literally it preys on your mind quite frequently, I'd imagine, because you've always got stimuli and things that are highly relevant to what you do.
Absolutely. The answer to how I switch off is I don't. No, it's always with me, but I don't think of it as something separate. I don't think of it as like, and now I'm going to apply science to my brain. It's just, it's just part of who I am. I think of myself as this neurons and DNA and chemicals and all of those things together. Not just that, of course. It's not when you're saying that you're made of cells and chemicals. It's not I am only chemicals and cells. No, it's all the other wonderful, complicated things that arise as a result of that. But I am aware of all those biochemical and cellular and mechanistic parts of my brain and my body. And, I'm constantly running an experiment. My whole life is one big experiment on my brain. I'm observing it all the time.
Be remiss of me not to get some tips on memory. I mean, you've talked about the science behind it, and cramming not a good idea. Are there any tips you've got for people to sort of just improve their memory, or if they really want to make sure something's committed, how to do that?
I don't really have any evidence to support this, but my sense is that when people ask me about their memory, it's usually students come up to me and say, "Oh, my memory
Yeah,
is
because this
horrible.
is the guy I
How
need
do
to
I?"
speak to, right?
Yeah,
If
yeah,
you've
yeah.
got
What do
you
I
on
do? What
tap,
do
of
I
course I'm
do?
going to come and talk to you.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And my sense is that what they think of as problems with memory is usually a problem with attention, because you memorize things better, or really you only memorize things if you pay attention to them. And that is something that we have some control over, but not complete control. I think that that's the way to improve memory, to understand what you're paying attention to and why. Uh, I think the best way to remember things is to do things that you're interested in, because that's what you will be drawn to. That's what your brain wants to memorize. To stuff into your brain something that it considers boring is extremely difficult. But anything that you're interested in, you don't have to make any effort to memorize it. So my tip would be to listen to yourself, to not work against your brain, to use your interest and even boredom as assets. If you're bored, that's an indication that you have to switch to something else. Make another task. Have a bunch of tasks that you can switch between, that at any given time you're interested in at least one of them. And then you won't have to think about how to memorize things. That's my tip.
And I guess if we were thinking about how to influence other people, what you've pointed towards there, I mean, we talk about the attention economy and all, and grabbing people's attention and the battle for eyeballs and ears.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really why, right? Is if we want to land inside people's heads, then we
Hmm.
then we
Hmm.
then we have to grab that attention becomes absolutely significant. Hence, you
Yeah.
get people doing things for effect, performative.
Absolutely. And combine that to what we've discussed about the limits to our memory, about how we're saturated with information and we can't distinguish between important and unimportant, real and not real. We're operating at these like tiny, tiny differences in synaptic strings because everything is so saturated. At least that's what I believe is happening to us in the modern world. Well, and everybody's fighting for that attention. We have very little of it to give, and yeah, and that's why it's so difficult to memorize anything or to really decide what you want to memorize. It's constantly pulled in all directions, and all you get is these fragmented the soup. So I think the solution is both to reduce that background hum of stimulation as much as you can, to be selective about what you let into your brain. Don't think of it as infinitely memorizing. Think of it, well, you have a limit. If you had a bar that said how much memory capacity you're using, if you could see it, and if you were told that you can't delete anything, you can only wait until it very, very slowly reduces. Well, I think we'd be very selective about what we watch and what social media we open. We just can't see it. But keep that in your mind. It does exist. Your memory is not infinite. And if you get to 95%, that you constantly hover at that 95%, well, that's when you can't remember anything.
And that's interesting as I think about trying to communicate to people. Often, a logic that gets deployed in society in general, but we can think of specific context, is kind of this is important, so that therefore they will listen.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so what you're pointing towards there is actually that's a complete flaw, right? It is down to the individual whether they are interested in it or not. It's not a logical process. It's a do I feel like this matters to me?
Absolutely. And yes, there are things that are objectively more important, but if you are saturated with the soup, that won't make any difference. If you're not saturated with the soup and somebody tells you, this is really important, okay, that might make you think, okay, I really have to pay attention to this. Let me allocate more of my mental resources to this thing. That allows you to do it. But if your memory is saturated the way that I think it is saturated, well, you can't do it, even if you want to. Even if you decide that that's important, you still can't distinguish it between like a meme that you saw 2 hours ago.
Which is quite depressing, and but I love there is an uplifting bit to your because well, I guess it has to be right because we it is what it is, right? It's like we can't we
Yeah.
can't we can't change anything, and therefore we have to. I guess to a certain extent, when you talk about these things as features, like we have to think in those terms because otherwise it'd be quite debilitating. And so the positive uplifting bit is true, but it's also just a framing of the way that our bodies function that we have to accept.
Yeah, I think the uplifting message is that we do have control over it. And the more we know about it, the more I think we will naturally apply it. It's just that we are not really yet aware of the inner workings of our brain, but we are becoming more increasingly aware of it. And I think as it enters popular culture, as this language of neuroscience becomes our everyday language, I think it will just become accepted hygiene. I think we will look back at the early days of the internet and social media as this like wild west of what were we doing with our brain in the way that we look now at the people used to smoke and half a century ago doctors would smoke, everybody would smoke, and now we look at it, oh, what's going on with you guys? I think that we might arrive at a similar thing with our brain inputs just by virtue of knowing more about it, and I think that's a very good thing. We will become happier as a result. We'll become smarter maybe as a result, and that is hopefully the next step in cultural progress.
And I guess, when you talk in those terms, that's a really interesting comparison because one of the reason that smoking became so prevalent, there was a vested interest in that continuing.
Absolutely.
And
That's an
so we
interesting
can
point.
see the same thing happening here. There's a vested interest in misinformation, in keeping us on platforms, in
Yeah,
frankly filling our mind
attention.
with stuff. So there's the
100%.
same challenge that we have with that, I guess, with brains, attention, memory, all those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So well, hopefully, as we recognize it at the level of a society, we will have some regulatory frameworks like we have with smoking. It's hard to imagine now, uh, but I hope that that's where we'll go. But I think it will have to start individually. I think that people will just be more hygienic about how they approach information. I think that's inevitable. I don't think we can absorb more information that we're currently absorbing.
And one of the best information we should be absorbing is your book. Tell us a little bit about that, because obviously, I mean, it's a fascinating area, and I can see your passion to share this with as many people as possible. But tell us about the book and what prompted you to write it.
Yeah, so the book was published in Russia a few years ago, and it did well, still doing well, and it's been a long process to bring it to English language, and yeah, for years now I've been trying to formulate in English what is this book really about. And just last week I had a student come into my office and say, "Hey, can you recommend a book that would explain why, if we are all animals and there's no meaning, does it feel so meaningful to be myself?" And I said, "Wow, you've just put my book in one sentence. I've been trying to do this for years, and you did a better job than I did." So that's what the book is really about. It's this idea that science tells us that everything's the same. Everything's made of the same atoms and molecules, and chemically I'm the same as a mushroom, and really I'm the same animal as a mouse, and monkeys and us, like I'm not different at all, and I am the same as you, and yet it feels very different to be a first person versus looking at other people. It feels very different to be human compared to all the other species in the world. It feels very different to be alive versus all those inanimate rocks and other planets that exist in the world. So it seems like at each level there's this paradox that we are told that everything's the same, and yet we are intuitively seeing that there's some wall that separates us from everything else. And I think you can understand all those walls if you visualize the history of the world and how we humans come out of it as a whole. So that's what the book does. It's a journey from the origin of life to the human species and human language and culture. And throughout this journey, it tries to understand, what did nature intend? What was the idea behind a protein and DNA? What was the idea behind the cell? What was the idea behind our domain of eukaryotes as opposed to bacteria and archaea? What was the idea behind a vertebrate, an animal, a vertebrate, a mammal, a primate, a human? So I call those ideas, and not human ideas, they're nature's ideas. They are the ideas that that evolution and natural selection places in living matter. I call them essences. So this book is about the essence of being human, being myself, and how does that essence arise out of the natural world in this process of evolution.
And so, really, you're looking at, I guess, Mother Nature's business plan, right? Well, how does what's the strategy here? How's that executed?
That's an excellent way to put it. Yes. And the point that I make is that our inner world, the very experience of being human, being alive, being myself here now, evolved as part of this natural world, as part of nature's master plan or business plan.
And I think, I mean, it's fascinating because it's, if I think back, obviously you can only write this with the benefit of modern science, but if we go back, this is challenging ancient orthodoxy, which brings us nicely back to that. Lots of things that we've thought have come from that era, and obviously it's now an accepted part of modern society, at least, that we can talk about science, and that we don't. There is a tension between things like religion and various other narratives that are there, but it's fascinating. I mean, you're really unpicking, I guess, the things that science has allowed us to start thinking. And what I find really interesting is you're simultaneously unpicking modern day orthodoxy, but you're using, I guess it's the path has been trodden already by previous scientists, allowing you to write this. So this is a logical
Of course.
continuation of Darwin and without wishing to pick on one, but just as a classic example of that sort of
Mhm.
path.
Yeah. But like you said, I think my goal is also to connect it to philosophy and even religion, to the ways that people used to think about life in the past. I can give you one example that I mentioned in the book. Our modern understanding of perception, of the way that the cerebral cortex works, it's centered on these two opposing streams of information. We simultaneously move information, say from our ears, we perceive individual frequencies of sound, and then that goes into the brain, and then some brain cells pick out patterns of those frequencies, and then there are some cells that pick out patterns of frequencies, and so on. So it moves from specific to more and more and more and more abstract. That's called the bottom-up pathway. And then there's also the top-down pathway that emanates from within the brain and uses patterns that it already knows to pick out something from the sensory information. So it already knows, for example, the sound of your name, and it is actively looking for that name in the stream of sound. That's why if you're at a cocktail party, there's a wall of sound, but somebody says your name on the other side of the room, you immediately zero into that.
Except the younger version of me
who's
not will have forgotten it. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have forgotten your name, yes, and would not hear it, yes. But if you do remember, you would pick it out. And because there's also this opposing top-down pathway, we're not just absorbing information, we're also actively looking for that information in the outside world. And those two simultaneous pathways, that's what creates our perception, and I would argue even our consciousness. So, Plato had an account of visual perception. For them, the brain didn't matter. They didn't know what the brain did. They thought that perception is produced by sense organs, by eyes and ears, and they communicate directly to the soul. Really funny. Okay, great. What were all these ancient philosophers smoking? But if you think about what he actually said, what he said was, visual perception is based on these two fires. There's this fire that emanates from your eyes, and then there's this fire that comes from the outside world. And they didn't know about how light works yet. They didn't know that light travels in straight lines, that it's not obvious. So when those two fires coalesce, they produce a common thing, this undulating thing, and then that thing passes its undulations to the soul. I mean, that is surprisingly accurate. It's just that he was talking about eyes and he didn't understand how the brain works. And for him, it all happens outside of the eyes. But there are these two streams of information, there's something that you project from yourself into the outside world, something with which you feel that outside world, and something that comes from the outside world towards you. And it's both of those things that form that perception. So that's what Plato said. And that's exactly how modern neuroscience says our perception works. And this is not something we knew even 20 years ago. We've just discovered it. This is new information. And actually, thousands of years ago, there was something very similar. If we just allow if we allow ourselves to think in terms in which ancient people thought, you realize they weren't stupid. They were just as smart as us. They were just operating under different assumptions, using different vocabulary. But we can learn a lot from that.
And you've got me thinking about intuition and some of the things that we naturally come born with, and that does sort of take us into nurture versus nature. But I'm always intrigued by intuition that sometimes pulls from memory that may not be there. So I kind of instinctively know what to do, even if I've not experienced that situation myself. How should we think about that in the context of memory? Is it pulling a memory from somewhere, or am I just plugging gaps and it happens to be the right answer?
Well, think about a language model, this transformers, Claude or ChatGPT. The way that they analyze different words is by mapping them onto these different dimensions. They associate different words with each other based on these hidden dimensions. What are those dimensions? What do they represent? Do they represent the color of the word, or the length of the word, or the size of the object? No, none of those things. We don't know what they mean. We have no words for them. It's just associations. And by combining 50 different associations, the language model will produce something that looks very much like understanding what that word is. So I think the same thing is happening in our brain too. We associate different concepts and experiences and ideas in ways that we don't necessarily understand, and we don't necessarily can name or have words for. But that doesn't mean that those connections are not there. So my guess would be that intuition is associations that we are not aware of, that we don't perceive to be there, that we don't describe using words, and they can work in the same way as our regular memory, except outside of our language and maybe even conscious awareness. That's what it is, in my opinion. But maybe there's more to it. I would be very excited if we learned something more about intuition and discover that there's an extra component to it.
I love that. And you brought me to the final thing I wanted to ask you about was thinking about AI and as it's pretending to be human. And I wonder
Mhm.
what your thoughts were on the impact that's having, because for the first time, we're confronted with something that kind of pretends to be like we are. And and you can see that in the sense of people, people telling it things they would never tell. So using it for therapy.
Mhm.
So we know,
Mhm. Mhm.
and this is going to take us to some really interesting spaces when it starts to manifest itself in physical robots. But for now, it's
Oh yeah.
we're being confronted with something that seems to be like us, and in fact appears to be more intelligent than we are. And I wonder
Mhm.
what your thoughts on that were.
I oscillate between giddy, excited, and terrified. It's so new that I really haven't formulated a thesis yet. I really don't know what to think. I think excitement is probably my main idea, just because it seems so transformed and so new. And imagine this 10 years ago. Imagine showing Plato an LLM. Imagine that. I mean, what would they think? I think they would not have any arguments about like, is this thing human, or they would just say, yep, that's it, you got it, that's it, done. That's that's the human mind. But yeah, so what does that mean for us? I mean, I hope that it means good things, but I worry that we might rely on them too much and just lose our humanness. That we'll outsource our humanness to language models and forget how to talk to each other. Unfortunately, I'm seeing some indications of that in my students already. I hope that together with having a better hygiene for social media, we'll develop some better relationship with artificial intelligence, where we'll know what's our thing and what's their thing. But I think we're still figuring that out. I use AI a lot, and I'm excited about it. I think I am in the camp that argues that there isn't necessarily a fundamental difference between um, our mind and artificial intelligence, our intelligence and artificial intelligence. I don't think it's there yet. I don't think it replicates our minds quite neatly. And of course, there's a big difference between an embodied mind like our own that has body experiences that inhabits a real three-dimensional physical world versus an intelligence that only bases its perception of reality on words. But words do take up a large part of our mind. And so that part, I think, is emulated, maybe even recreated fairly accurately. And I think you're right. I don't know what will happen when we put those things into actual physical bodies and we'll allow them to have their own experiences.
And I mean, it strikes me, taking us back to the beginning, it strikes me that actually your research into thinking about the idea of memory existing throughout the body, that's an interesting thing when we try to create robots and we think, because we do build sensors into them in interesting
Mhm.
places. So there's almost that thinking that's there already, but you've added a
Mhm.
layer of complexity that if you really want to replicate the human body, there may be some
Mhm.
extra things
Mhm.
to think about in terms of the research that you're doing.
Yeah, and those extra things, I would say, boil down to patterning in time. That's what AI doesn't do yet. So there's abstraction. We find patterns in ongoing things. We look at a set of things and we abstract the meaning. We extract, like in the example of frequencies. We hear a bunch of frequencies and we extract patterns from there. Um, so that's abstraction. That's what AI can do. That's one form of pattern finding. But another form of pattern finding is memory. It's when you detect a pattern in time, when you detect the difference between 4 pulses spaced 10 minutes versus one pulse that's 12 minutes. That's also pattern finding, except it's not immediate patterns, not a pattern in a set, but it's pattern in time. So we employ both. We extract patterns from sets and we extract patterns from time. At the moment, AI only extracts patterns from sets. There's no time component. It's just fed troves of information. It learns from that, and then that's it. That's what it remembers, and then it produces outputs based on prompts, inference. So I think what will happen over time is that AI will also learn to find patterns in time, and for that, it would probably need to inhabit a real three-dimensional world. So probably it would have to be embodied in a robot, in some android. And then once that android actually learns from patterns in the same way as we do in time, it will revert to being a member of our world that will learn at the same rate as we do, will change its mind over time, will modify its memories, and that will bring it closer to us, I think.
Wow. Amazing. I could keep talking to you forever, but I'm very conscious of time. Thank you for what you do, because it's super interesting. I love the fact that we don't quite know where it's going, but we know that it could be really important. I think that's super exciting. Thank you for helping the younger version of me resolve the mystery that I've carried for
And they remember his name.
carried for decades. I think I still know what my name is. I'll probably, do you know what? It'll be the answer to that question that will displace from my but I think that's a legitimate swap. So I've been carrying this burden with me for decades. So thank you for resolving that. I will put details of the book and your research and some articles that we talked about in the show notes. So thank you so much for the work that you do. But above all, thank you for being an amazing guest on the show.
Thank you, Christian. This was really fun. Thank you so much.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Nikolay for appearing. To find out more about Nikolay, his book, One Hand Clapping, which unravels the mystery of the human mind from a molecular and evolutionary perspective, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. And if you like what you heard, why not leave a review? It helps other curious minds to find the show. To discover episodes of the show that you may have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show. But in the meantime, stay safe, perhaps by being a little bit more conscious of the patterns in your daily life. You never know what your cells might be remembering. But above all, thank you so much for listening.